Just lie for us on camera and say our lifestyle didn't mess you up. My throat closed so fast I couldn't even fake a polite laugh. The living room smelled like lemon cleaner and old fabric, the kind my mother always used before company came. I'd driven 3 hours to their place on a Sunday because my father had texted, "We miss you. Come by. We want to talk." He'd added a little heart emoji, something he never did when I was a kid, something that always felt like a costume he put on when he wanted the moment to look softer than it really was. My mother had set out coffee like we were strangers she needed to impress. The mugs were the matching kind with tiny blue flowers, the ones she used when she wanted a conversation to feel civil. I sat on the edge of the couch, knees together, purse in my lap like a shield. My hands were damp. I kept wiping them against the leather strap, hoping neither of them noticed. They didn't start with how I'd been. They didn't ask about work, or the apartment I'd finally made feel like mine, or the therapy I'd been dragging myself to for a year like it was physical rehab. No. My mother leaned forward with that bright, practiced expression she used in photos and said, "So, exciting news." My father's eyes flicked to her, then to me, like he was watching a tennis match and already knew who was going to swing. "There's a documentary," my mother continued, voice warm, "about families like ours, poly families. They want to show how healthy it can be, how normal it is when everyone is honest." The word normal landed in my chest like a thumb pressing on an old bruise. "They asked if you'd be willing to interview," my father said. His tone was casual, like he was asking if I wanted dessert. "Just a few questions, balance the narrative. People have so many misconceptions." My mother nodded quickly. "They want the children's perspective. It's important. You could help so many people." I stared at the steam rising from my coffee. I hadn't even taken a sip. The surface trembled slightly, like the cup was trying to warn me. I forced my voice to work. "What would you want me to say?" My mother's smile tightened. "Just the truth. That it didn't harm you. That you had a good childhood. That it's not what people think." My father didn't blink. "And if there were any hard feelings, you can frame it as growing pains. People will understand, but the message has to be clear, that it didn't mess kids up." That was when the sentence came, flat, clean, rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in the car. "Just lie for us on camera and say our lifestyle didn't mess you up." The silence after that was too quiet, like the house itself had stepped back. My mother's eyes flashed at him. "Don't say it like that." Then she turned her brightness back on me. "He didn't mean lie," she said quickly. "He just means, you know how the media is. They twist things. We need you to be careful with wording." Something in me went cold, not rage yet, more like my body recognizing a familiar shape of danger and going still. I set the mug down carefully on the coaster. I didn't want them to hear it clink. "I can't do it," I said. My mother laughed once, too sharp. "Come on, why would you refuse? We were good parents." My father's jaw tightened. He leaned back, arms crossing, the picture of calm. "What's the issue?" I felt my pulse in my ears. "The issue is I can't sit in front of a camera and pretend it was fine." My mother's smile dropped as if someone had turned off a light. "Pretend," she repeated. The word came out offended, almost wounded. I held my hands together so tightly my knuckles hurt. "You want me to tell the world it didn't affect me? It did." My father stared at me with that blank, strategic patience I remembered from childhood, like if he waited long enough I'd correct myself. "You never said any of this before." "I didn't know I was allowed to," I heard myself say, and my voice surprised me with how steady it was. "I was a kid. You told me it was normal, so I learned to swallow it." My mother's cheeks flushed. "Swallow what? Love? Honesty? We weren't cheating. We were ethical." The way she said ethical made my stomach twist, like a label could erase the years of me coming home from school and finding a stranger in my kitchen. Like a stranger's shoes by the door didn't change the air in your own house. I kept my eyes on her because if I looked at my father, I knew I'd either start crying or stop breathing. I felt like I had to compete for you, I said. I felt like there was always someone else who mattered more. My mother shook her head fast. That's not true. My father's voice stayed even. We provided for you. We were present. Were you? The question came out before I could soften it. A tight silence followed. My father's eyes narrowed a fraction. My mother pressed her lips together as if she was holding herself back from calling me ungrateful. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips. My 10th birthday, I said, and I didn't mean to bring it up, but it was already there. You invited people I didn't even know. You disappeared into the kitchen and the backyard with them like my party was background noise. My mother's eyes widened. That is not how it happened. My father exhaled through his nose. You're remembering it wrong. That sentence hit harder than I expected, not because it was new, but because it was the exact same move. Rewrite, minimize, smooth the edges until I looked like the problem. I leaned forward without meaning to. Do you know what it felt like? I said, voice climbing. To walk into the house at 6 years old, bleeding from my knee, and see you with a man I'd never seen before, and you telling me it's fine? Like my confusion was embarrassing? My mother's face crumpled in disbelief. We never did anything inappropriate around you. You kissed them, I snapped. You flirted, you touched, you made jokes like I wasn't there, and half the time the people you brought around didn't even know I existed. My father's eyes flashed finally. That's not fair. The room felt smaller. The air felt hot and thin. My voice was getting louder and I couldn't seem to pull it back down. I was always the extra, I said. I was the thing you had to remember to include. I didn't feel like your child. I felt like a roommate who happened to be small. My mother's eyes filled instantly, like tears were her last defense when the conversation stopped obeying her script. We loved you, she whispered, almost pleading. How can you say that? I stood up so fast the couch creaked. My knees shook, but I didn't sit back down. Because love isn't just a feeling, I said, voice breaking at the edges. It's what you choose first, and you didn't choose me first. My father stood too, slower, controlled. Lower your voice. That was it. That was the button in my chest that had been wired since childhood, the command to be manageable. I heard myself say it before I could stop it. The truth is, it did mess me up, I said, and my voice rose, rough, unfamiliar. And you shouldn't have had a child if your number one priority was having access to everyone in the world. My mother made a sound like she'd been struck. Tears spilled down her cheeks. My father's face went hard, all warmth evaporating. Get out, he said quietly, pointing toward the door like I was a stranger who'd tracked mud onto his carpet. I stood there for 1 second longer, the way you stand after a slap, trying to decide whether you're allowed to feel pain. Then I grabbed my purse and walked out, and behind me the front door clicked shut with a final, careful sound that made my whole body understand what the next part of this was going to cost. I drove the first 10 minutes without realizing I was crying. The road out of their neighborhood curved past trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes, the kind of place where nothing ever looked wrong from the outside. My hands were locked on the steering wheel so tight my wrists ached. At a red light, I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve and took one long breath that scraped on the way in. My phone buzzed before I even reached the highway. I didn't look at it. I already knew who it was. The buzzing came again at the next light. Then again, longer this time, like someone leaning on a doorbell. I dropped the phone into the cup holder, face down, and turned the radio on, too loud, just to fill the space. By the time I got home, my chest felt hollowed out, like something essential had been removed and the air was rushing through where it used to be. I kicked my shoes off near the door and stood there in the dim entryway, not moving, listening to the quiet of my own place. No voices, no footsteps, no need to brace. The silence should have felt like relief. Instead, it pressed on me, heavy and unresolved. My phone buzzed again. This time I picked it up. It was my father. "We are sorry you feel that way. Can we have a calm discussion about this soon?" I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. The phrase "sorry you feel that way" slid under my skin like a familiar blade. Carefully phrased, technically polite, completely empty. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard, then dropped. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and went to wash my hands, scrubbing harder than necessary, as if whatever I'd carried out of their house could be rinsed away. An hour later, the phone buzzed again. My mother this time. "Sweetheart, I've been crying all afternoon. I don't understand where this is coming from." I leaned against the counter, my forehead resting on the cool laminate. The refrigerator hummed behind me, steady and indifferent. I typed, "I need some time," then erased it. Typed nothing. Put the phone down again. The next morning, I woke to 3 missed calls and a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. "Hi," a cheerful woman's voice said, overly bright. "This is Mara from Bright Lens Productions. Your parents gave us your contact information. We're so excited about the possibility of including your perspective in our upcoming documentary. We'd love to chat when you have a moment." My stomach dropped. I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the silence after the beep like it might explain how my private pain had already been handed to strangers. I didn't call back. By noon, my inbox filled with messages that weren't angry, exactly, just disappointed. "Your mother is beside herself. You really hurt her. They only wanted to do something good." One text came from my aunt, a woman who had never once asked me how I was growing up, but somehow always knew when my parents needed support. "Families don't talk like that to each other," she wrote. "You owe them an apology." I sat at my desk, staring at the wall. The light from the window bleaching everything pale and exposed. My chest tightened. I felt 12 years old again, standing in a room full of adults who had already decided what the story was going to be. A memory tried to surface, and I pushed it down. Not now. That afternoon, my mother called again. I watched it ring until it stopped. The phone buzzed immediately after with a photo she sent without comment. Her and my father sitting on the couch, her eyes red, his arms stiff around her shoulders. The familiar living room framed them, tidy, composed, like a scene arranged for sympathy. I didn't respond. An hour later, my father emailed, subject line, "Family conversation." The email was long, measured, careful. He wrote about misunderstandings, about how emotions can distort memories, about how airing grievances publicly could have consequences. He reminded me, gently, of how much they'd sacrificed to give me stability. At the bottom, one line stood alone. "We hope you'll reconsider participating. Your voice matters." I closed the laptop with more force than necessary. By evening, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my cousin, someone I spoke to maybe once a year. "Heard things are tense," she wrote. "Just remember, not everyone gets parents brave enough to live authentically." The word brave made my jaw tighten. I went for a walk after dark, the air cool against my face. Streetlights cast harsh circles on the pavement, everything outside them dissolving into shadow. I walked fast, as if movement alone could keep the pressure from settling back onto my ribs. Halfway around the block, my phone buzzed again. A message from Mara at Bright Lens Productions. "We understand this might be sensitive. Just know we're committed to presenting a positive, empowering story for all involved." I stopped under a streetlight and stared at the message. The light buzzed overhead, flickering once. Positive, empowering. Words polished smooth enough to erase the parts that didn't fit. I typed back before I could stop myself. "I won't be participating." The typing bubble appeared almost instantly. "Of course. We're just concerned your parents are feeling blindsided. If there's anything we can do to help you feel more comfortable, let us know." I put the phone back in my pocket and kept walking, my breath coming shallow. It wasn't just my parents anymore. It was a network. Family, professionals, well-meaning outsiders, closing ranks around a story I was expected to support. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face crumpling, my father's finger pointing toward the door. I heard his voice telling me to lower my voice, felt again the heat of that room, the way the air had seemed to thin when I stopped being agreeable. In the morning, my therapist called. "I saw you tried to move your appointment up," she said gently. "Do you want to come in today?" I hesitated. The instinct to say I'm fine rose automatically, then faded. "Yes," I said. Sitting across from her later, I wrapped my hands around a paper cup of water. She listened without interrupting as I described the visit, the documentary, the messages piling up. When I finished, she didn't rush to reassure me. She just said, "It sounds like, when you told the truth, the system around you reacted." The word system echoed in my chest. On my way out, as I reached for the door, she added quietly, "You're not responsible for managing their feelings." The sentence landed softly, but it stayed. Back home, I found a letter taped to my door, my mother's handwriting, looping, careful. Inside, she wrote about heartbreak, about confusion, about how she never knew I felt this way. She wrote that she wished I'd trusted them enough to talk sooner. She ended with, "Please don't let strangers define our family." I sat on the floor with the letter spread across my knees, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. The hallway was dim, the light from the window at the end casting long shadows along the walls. For the first time since I'd left their house, something inside me shifted. Not relief, not resolve, but a hard, quiet understanding that this wasn't going to be smoothed over with time or tone, no matter how calm the discussion was supposed to be. When I think back far enough, the memories don't arrive as scenes so much as sensations. Light first. The way it used to fall through the tall windows of the apartment we lived in when I was small, turning dust into something almost alive. Sound next. The low hum of traffic outside, voices drifting through rooms that never quite felt private, and then the constant awareness of movement. People coming, people leaving, shoes by the door that weren't ours. I learned early to recognize footsteps. Some were heavy and confident, like my father's. Some were light and quick, like my mother's when she was excited. Others were unfamiliar, hesitant pauses, unsure rhythms. Those always made my stomach tighten, even before I knew why. I was 6 when I skinned my knee in the driveway chasing a ball that rolled too fast. I remember the sting before the pain, the warm slickness on my leg, the way I pressed my palm to it and ran inside without thinking. The house smelled like something sweet and sharp, not dinner, not soap. Voices came from the living room, low and tangled together. I stopped short in the hallway. My parents were there with a man I didn't know, bodies close, laughter soft and breathy. My knee throbbed. I stood frozen, holding my leg, feeling like I'd opened a door I wasn't supposed to. My mother saw me first. Her smile didn't disappear. It just rearranged itself. She knelt, wiped my knee with a towel, kissed my hair. "It's okay," she said gently, like she always did. "We just love more people than most." I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. Calm, certain, final. I nodded because nodding was easier than asking questions I didn't have language for yet. After that, the house changed shape, or maybe I just started seeing it clearly. People stayed for dinner, people stayed overnight. Sometimes people stayed long enough to leave toothbrushes in the bathroom, coats draped over chairs, books stacked beside the couch. My parents called them friends, partners, chosen family. I learned their names quickly because forgetting them felt dangerous, like it would mark me as rude, or worse, ungrateful. Birthdays blurred into gatherings where my cake shared space with wine bottles and conversations that floated above my head. On my 10th birthday, there were 3 guests I'd never met before. I remember standing in the yard with a paper plate in my hands, watching my parents lean together on the patio, laughing with people whose faces didn't turn when I blew out the candles. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself this was adulthood, and childhood was just something you endured quietly until you grew out of it. At school, when other kids talked about sleepovers or family movie nights, I listened more than I spoke. I didn't have words that fit. I learned early how to deflect, how to shrug and smile and say, "We're kind of unconventional." The teachers smiled when I said it. Adults always liked that word. By 12, I could read a room before stepping into it. I could tell from the shoes by the door whether it was safe to ask for help with homework or better to disappear into my room. I learned how to make myself small without seeming sulky, how to entertain myself quietly, how to stay out of the way. My room became my anchor. There was one object I guarded fiercely, a small portable cassette player I saved for over an entire year to buy. I counted coins. I skipped buying snacks after school. When I finally brought it home, it felt like something I owned completely, something untouched by anyone else's desires. I listened to the same tapes over and over, headphones pressed tight, the whirring click of the buttons steady and predictable. The music didn't change based on who was visiting. It didn't shift moods suddenly. It didn't require me to adjust. When I put the headphones on, the house receded. My parents didn't notice the player the way I hoped they would. There was no comment about my discipline, my patience, the quiet way I learned to manage myself. They were busy, always emotionally engaged elsewhere. They weren't cruel. That's the part that confused me the most for years. They remembered birthdays. They showed up to school events. They told me they loved me. But love, in our house, felt like a shared resource spread thin, rationed carefully, and redistributed often. I learned not to ask for more. In my teens, the visitors slowed. Some left, some drifted away. There were arguments behind closed doors, voices sharper now, less idealistic. The house felt heavier, not lighter. The openness my parents had celebrated turned into tension they didn't talk about. I kept my head down, focused on grades, focused on getting out. At 17, I packed my things and moved into a small apartment near campus. I remember standing in the doorway one last time, my cassette player in a box under my arm, and feeling nothing. No ache, no relief, just a clean, quiet detachment. For years after, I didn't think about it much. That was the strange part. I told myself it hadn't been that bad, that everyone has quirks, that mine were just more visible. It wasn't until therapy decades later that the feelings resurfaced, not as stories, but as patterns. Why I struggled to trust closeness, why I felt restless in relationships, like attention was something temporary, always at risk of being redirected, why I felt guilty for wanting to be someone's first priority. My therapist didn't label my parents. She didn't assign blame. She asked questions. What did you need that you didn't get? The question sat in my chest for weeks before it answered itself. I needed consistency. I needed to know that when I walked into a room hurt or scared, I wouldn't have to compete with someone else's desire to be seen. I needed the certainty that my presence mattered more than someone else's novelty. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with grief. And grief, once named, has a way of sharpening everything else. When my parents called years later, voices bright, talking about a documentary, about representation and truth, they were asking me to lend my voice to a story that had never made room for mine. They wanted the cassette player turned down, the edges smoothed, the noise erased. Sitting on my living room floor with my mother's letter in my hands, I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to adjust, to soften, to make it easier for everyone else. I folded the letter carefully, placed it on the table, and sat there in the dim light, listening to the hum of my refrigerator, the steady sound grounding me in the present. For the first time, I didn't reach for my phone to explain myself. I just sat with the truth I'd carried quietly for decades, knowing that once acknowledged, it wouldn't fit back into the small, convenient shape my parents preferred. The shift didn't come as an explosion. It came as a tightening. After the letter, after the calls I didn't return, the tone changed. Not openly hostile, not loud, just altered. Like furniture moved slightly in a dark room so you keep bumping into corners you swear weren't there before. My mother stopped calling me by my name in messages. She started with sweetheart again, the way she used to when she wanted to sound wounded rather than wrong. My father switched to emails only, carefully spaced, always ending with a line about respectful dialogue. The first silence hit harder than any argument. A week passed with nothing, no messages, no calls. I caught myself checking my phone anyway, that old reflex twitching like a phantom limb. Part of me waited for them to come crashing in, furious. Another part hoped for something else, a question, an apology, a crack. Nothing came. Then, suddenly, my aunt posted a photo on social media. My parents sitting under studio lights, microphones clipped neatly to their collars. The caption read, "Brave conversations. Truth matters." I stared at the image until my eyes burned. They hadn't told me the filming had already started. My phone buzzed almost immediately after. My mother. "We didn't want to pressure you. This is just preliminary footage. No question mark. No pause for my response." That night, I couldn't sleep. The dark pressed in, heavy and airless. I lay on my side listening to the clock tick, each second loud enough to feel accusatory. When I finally drifted off, it was shallow and brittle. The next humiliation arrived quietly, disguised as concern. My father emailed to ask for my childhood photos. "They want visuals," he wrote. "Nothing invasive, just family moments, smiles, holidays. You always look so happy." I read the line twice. You always looked so happy. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I imagined my face on screen, a child version of me smiling because children smile when cameras appear, because they're taught that's what being good looks like. I didn't respond. 2 days later, my mother followed up. "If you're uncomfortable being interviewed, at least let us show that you were okay. It would mean a lot." A lot to whom? I sat at my kitchen table, the overhead light too bright, my coffee gone cold. My hands trembled slightly as I folded them together, willing them to still. The urge to explain myself surged, thick, urgent, exhausting. I typed, "Please stop involving me." She replied an hour later. "We're not involving you. We're just telling our story." The words slid neatly into place, rewriting reality with surgical precision. The third blow came from a stranger. Mara from Bright Lens Productions emailed me directly, looping my parents in. She thanked me for my honesty and said they wanted to ensure all perspectives felt heard, but added that negative framing can unintentionally harm marginalized communities. I felt my throat close as I read it. Harm whom? I stared at the screen, the white space glaring. My reflection stared back, faintly distorted by the glass. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The air felt stuck halfway down my lungs. I pushed my chair back and stood, pacing the small length of my apartment, bare feet slapping softly against the floor. My chest ached with a familiar pressure, the sensation of being cornered without anyone raising their voice. When I sat back down, I typed carefully. "My experience isn't a framing. It's my life," Mara replied politely, too politely. Of course. We just want to avoid messaging that could be misunderstood. Misunderstood by whom? The silences grew strategic after that. My parents stopped contacting me directly. Instead, information reached me sideways, through relatives, through mutual acquaintances, through the slow drip of social media posts praising openness and honest love. At a family gathering I attended out of obligation, the room shifted when I walked in. Conversations paused, smiles tightened. An uncle clapped my father on the back and said loudly, "You two are so brave putting yourselves out there like that." My father smiled modestly. My mother dabbed at her eyes, already shining. No one looked at me. I stood near the snack table, fingers grazing the edge of a paper plate I didn't need. My hands felt numb. When my mother finally approached, she hugged me lightly, the way you hug someone you don't want to fully engage. "You look tired," she said, her voice soft. "Are you taking care of yourself?" I nodded, because nodding was still easier than saying what I wanted to say. Across the room, I caught my father's eye. He held it for a moment, expression unreadable, then looked away. The silence stretched. It exposed something raw and ugly beneath the surface. I was no longer part of the narrative unless I cooperated. On the drive home, my chest tightened until I had to pull over. I sat gripping the steering wheel, breath shallow, forehead pressed against it, waiting for the wave to pass. My hands shook, not dramatically, just enough to notice. That night, another email arrived, this one from my father, alone. "We're concerned your therapist might be influencing your perception," he wrote. "Sometimes professionals project their own biases. We'd hate for that to damage your relationship with us." I read it standing in my kitchen, the refrigerator humming behind me. The words rearranged the past neatly. My pain wasn't real. It was planted. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I felt sick again, knee bleeding, towel pressed too gently, told everything was fine. The next morning, my mother left a voicemail. Her voice trembled, but it never broke. "I just don't recognize you lately," she said. "This anger, it's not who you are. We raised you better than that." The line echoed long after the message ended. Raised you better. As if my restraint had been the product they were proud of all along. The pressure intensified in small, relentless ways. A cousin messaged to say the documentary crew asked about me and seemed confused by my absence. A family friend sent an article about children thriving in alternative family structures with a note that read, "Thought you might find this healing," as if the wound was a misunderstanding. At work, I found myself distracted, rereading the same email without absorbing it. My body stayed tense, braced, waiting for the next impact. When my phone buzzed, my stomach dropped automatically. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in my closet, looking for anything unrelated to my parents, I found the cassette player. The plastic was scratched now, the buttons worn. I held it in my hands, heavier than I remembered. For a second, I almost laughed at the absurdity of it still existing, intact, after everything else had been reshaped. I pressed play. The tape whirred, then music filled my ears, tinny and imperfect. I sat on the floor listening, the sound steady, familiar. It grounded me just long enough to notice how exhausted I felt. The lowest point came quietly. My mother emailed to say they'd like to dedicate the documentary to family resilience and wondered if I'd be willing to attend the premiere as support. No apology, no acknowledgement of harm, just a request. I stared at the message until the words lost meaning. My vision blurred. I realized I was crying only when a tear dropped onto the keyboard, darkening the keys. I didn't wipe it away right away. I just sat there, shoulders slumped, breath uneven, feeling the weight of decades pressing down all at once. For a brief, dangerous moment, hope flickered. Maybe if I went, maybe if I stayed quiet, maybe if I showed up smiling, they'd soften. Maybe the silence would lift. The thought barely formed before it collapsed under its own weight. I deleted the email. That night, lying in bed, the room dark and still, I felt something inside me finally give way, not into anger, not yet, but into a stark clarity that made my chest ache. They weren't misunderstanding me. They were choosing not to hear me. And as that truth settled, cold and undeniable, my phone buzzed once more on the nightstand, lighting up the room with a message that told me exactly how far they were willing to go to preserve their version of the story. The message was from my father. It was short. "We've decided to move forward without you. For the sake of everyone involved, we think distance might be best for now." I stared at the screen, the glow harsh in the dark room. The words didn't rush at me. They settled, heavy, deliberate, like something placed down with care. Distance. I set the phone face down and lay there, eyes open, listening to my own breathing, in and out, in and out. The ceiling fan clicked softly overhead, a loose rhythm I'd been meaning to fix. I didn't move to turn it off. For years, distance had been the thing I was expected to tolerate quietly. Now it was being framed as their boundary, their choice, their moral high ground. Something inside me shifted, not violently, not dramatically. It felt more like a joint slipping back into place after years of strain. Painful. Necessary. The next morning, I woke early before the alarm. The apartment was still dim, dawn just beginning to thin the darkness at the edges. I sat up slowly, feet on the cool floor, and waited for the familiar weight in my chest to descend. It didn't. The anxiety was there. Yes, low, buzzing. But beneath it was something else. A steadiness I didn't recognize at first. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the street wake up. A delivery truck idled. A woman walked her dog, scarf pulled tight against the chill. Ordinary life continuing, indifferent to my family's crisis. I realized then that for the first time in weeks, my phone hadn't buzzed overnight. No guilt-laced messages, no updates passed through other people, no pressure disguised as concern. The silence felt different now, less like punishment, more like space. Later that morning, my mother tried again. Her message was longer this time, paragraphs carefully spaced. She wrote about love, about misunderstanding, about how pain makes people say things they don't mean. She said she missed me. She said she was worried. She ended with, "We're your parents. We'll always be here when you're ready to talk respectfully." Respectfully. I read it once, then again. I noticed how none of it acknowledged what I'd said, how the hurt flowed only in one direction, how my role, even now, was to regulate my tone so they could stay comfortable. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and searched for my therapist's number. I moved my appointment up again. When I sat across from her that afternoon, I didn't cry. That surprised me. "I think they're cutting me off," I said. She nodded slowly. "How does that feel?" I thought about it. Really thought. The answer came quieter than expected. "Clear." She waited. "I keep realizing," I continued, "that I've been explaining myself my entire life, and it's never been enough. Not because I wasn't clear, but because clarity was never the goal." Her eyes stayed on mine, steady, encouraging me without pushing. "They want me silent or supportive," I said. "Anything else threatens the story they need." Saying it out loud didn't hurt the way I expected. It felt accurate. That evening, I went home and pulled out an old folder from the back of my closet. Inside were papers I'd never thrown away. School forms, report cards, old schedules. Proof, in a way, that I'd existed consistently, even when my presence had felt optional. At the bottom of the box, the cassette player rested, tangled in headphone cords. I sat on the floor and held it, thumb tracing the worn edge. I thought about how carefully I'd protected it as a child, how it had been my way of controlling sound, of choosing what entered my head when everything else felt unpredictable. I pressed play again. The tape clicked, then steadied. As the music filled the room, something clicked into place alongside it. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned itself out against their walls weeks ago. What remained was something colder, sharper. Decision. I opened my laptop again, not to write to them, but to myself. I started listing facts. Just facts. What I remembered, what I felt, what had been said, what had been denied. Not for revenge, not for an argument, for grounding. Halfway through, my phone buzzed. A notification from social media. Someone had tagged my parents in a post praising the documentary's honesty and courage. I didn't open it. Instead, I added another line to the document. They know how to be seen. They do not know how to listen. The next day, an email arrived from Mara again. Polite, professional, informing me that production was moving forward and thanking me for my consideration. I read it without flinching. I replied with one sentence. "Please do not contact me again." My finger hovered over the send button for a second. Then I pressed it. The The relief that followed wasn't emotional. It was physical. My shoulders dropped, my jaw unclenched, my breath deepened. That was when I understood what had actually changed. I wasn't waiting anymore, not for an apology, not for permission, not for them to finally understand. I was done trying to make my truth survivable for people who depended on my silence. That night, as I lay in bed, the room quiet, the city distant outside the window, I felt something settle into my bones, a resolve that didn't need to announce itself to be real. And just as sleep began to pull me under, my phone lit up once more, not with a message, but with a notification that confirmed they had taken the story somewhere I could no longer ignore. I found out by accident. A coworker mentioned it over lunch, voice casual, fork paused midair. "Hey," she said, "isn't that your parents?" She turned her phone toward me before I could answer. There they were, on a panel stage. My mother smiling softly into a microphone, my father leaning back with practiced ease. Behind them, a large screen displayed a still image from the documentary. Our old house, sunlit, welcoming, windows thrown open. My name wasn't mentioned, not yet. I stared long enough that my coworker frowned. "Sorry, should I not?" "It's fine," I said automatically, even as my stomach tightened. The word came out trained, polished by decades of use. Back at my desk, I pulled up the video. I told myself I was just curious, just gathering information, nothing more. The first 10 minutes were harmless enough. Talking points, language I recognized instantly, love, transparency, community. My parents spoke with the ease of people who had practiced these lines for years, refining them until they sounded both vulnerable and virtuous. Then my mother said it. "Our child struggled later in life," she said gently, eyes lowered with what looked like compassion. "But we believe that had more to do with outside influences than our family structure." Outside influences. The phrase landed with a dull thud, not explosive, just final. I closed the video and sat very still. My hands rested flat on the desk, palms down, grounding myself in the cool surface. Around me, keyboards clicked, phones rang, life continued. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a misunderstanding. That evening, I pulled every box out of my closet, not in a frenzy, slowly, methodically. One by one, I stacked them in the center of the room, the way I'd watched my father stack books when he wanted to feel in control. Inside the boxes were pieces of a life I'd never considered evidence before. Old calendars, school notices, birthday invitations, programs from events my parents hadn't attended because they were busy, notes from teachers about missed pickups, late arrivals, confusion over who was responsible that day. I laid them out on the floor, grouping them by year. As I worked, memories surfaced in sharp, manageable flashes. A cold afternoon waiting outside the school office. A substitute teacher asking which adult she should call. A permission slip returned unsigned because no one had time. I didn't dwell on any single moment for long. I couldn't afford to. This wasn't about reliving pain. It was about clarity. I found emails too, old ones, buried in an archive I'd forgotten about. Messages from my parents sent to each other, accidentally copied to me when I was a teenager. Logistics about who was staying over, who was watching me, who assumed the other had it covered. I printed them. The printer hummed steadily, page after page sliding out. The sound was oddly soothing, concrete, real. The cassette player sat on the coffee table nearby, silent but present. I didn't turn it on. Just having it there felt enough. Over the next few days, I worked quietly. I requested copies of my therapy intake notes, not interpretations, just timelines. Dates when certain issues had been discussed. Patterns that emerged long before I'd ever said the word polyamory out loud in that room. I emailed my old school district, requesting attendance records. It felt absurdly formal, but I'd learned that formality was a language institutions respected. I reached out to one person I hadn't spoken to in years, my childhood neighbor. She answered on the second ring, voice warm with surprise. We talked cautiously at first, circling the past like it might sting if touched directly. Then she said, unprompted, "I always worried about you." The sentence sat between us heavy. She remembered the strangers coming and going, remembered me sitting on her porch sometimes after school because no one was home yet, remembered asking my mother once if everything was okay and being told with a tight smile that some people were just judgmental. I didn't ask her for anything. I just listened. After we hung up, I wrote down what she'd said, word for word. At night, exhaustion set in, deep and bone-heavy. I slept in fragments, dreams flickering and dissolving. But the work steadied me, gave shape to the days. My parents noticed. My mother sent a message late one evening. "People are asking questions. I hope you're not feeding negativity." I didn't reply. My father followed up 2 days later. "We'd appreciate it if you didn't interfere. This affects more than just you." I read that sentence several times. The irony wasn't lost on me. I created a folder on my laptop, plain, labeled simply with the year I was born. Inside, I scanned everything. I didn't embellish. I didn't editorialize. I let the material speak. As I worked, I noticed something unexpected. My hands stopped shaking when my phone buzzed. The reflexive drop in my stomach dulled. I was no longer bracing for impact. I was preparing. One afternoon, my therapist asked gently, "What's your goal?" I considered the question carefully. "I don't want to destroy them," I said. "I just want the truth to exist somewhere that isn't their mouth." She nodded. "And what would that change for you?" I thought of the cassette player, the way it had given me control over sound in a chaotic house. "It would let me stop explaining," I said. A week later, an email arrived from the documentary's legal department. They'd received a complaint, it said, an inquiry about representation and consent. They were conducting an internal review and requested clarification on certain points. My heart didn't race this time. It slowed. I responded with professionalism I didn't know I possessed. Attached documents, dates, records. I used neutral language. No accusations, no emotion, just facts. When I hit send, I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. The room felt different. Not lighter. Sharper. That night, my father called. I let it ring. He left a voicemail. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it now. "We need to talk," he said. "You're creating unnecessary complications." Unnecessary. I didn't delete the message. I saved it. Later, scrolling through social media, I saw a teaser clip from the documentary. My mother spoke directly into the camera, voice earnest. "People who criticize our choices often misunderstand love," she said, "and sometimes, sadly, that misunderstanding comes from within the family." I watched it once, then again. Something cold settled in my chest. They were positioning me now, not just absent, but adversarial. I closed the app and opened my document instead, adding the clip to the folder, timestamp noted. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was building. And as I shut down my laptop for the night, the cassette player caught my eye again, its reflection faint in the darkened screen. Quiet, patient, waiting, while somewhere beyond my walls, the story they were telling began to crack in ways they hadn't anticipated. The room was colder than I expected. Not physically. There were lights, people, movement. But emotionally, the air had that sterile chill institutions use to pretend neutrality. A long table stretched across the center of the conference room, microphones clipped neatly along its edge. Water pitchers sat untouched, condensation beating down their sides like something quietly sweating under pressure. My parents sat together on one side. My mother wore soft colors, cream sweater, gentle makeup, the version of herself she used when she wanted to look approachable, reasonable, harmed. My father wore a dark jacket, posture relaxed, one arm draped behind her chair in a gesture that read as supportive without being intimate. They didn't look at me when I entered. The legal representative from Bright Lens Productions cleared his throat and gestured for everyone to sit. The words mediation session floated briefly in my mind before disappearing. This wasn't mediation. This was containment. I placed my folder on the table in front of me. It made a sound when it touched the surface. Not loud, just firm. That was the first time my father looked up. His eyes flicked to the folder, then to my face, then away again. A practiced move. Dismiss first, assess later. The producer spoke. Polite, careful. Thank you all for coming. We're here to address concerns that have been raised regarding representation, consent, and accuracy. My mother nodded, already composed. We've always been transparent, she said softly. That's why this hurts so much. I said nothing. The representative turned to me. You've submitted documentation. We'd like to give you space to clarify your concerns. I opened the folder. Paper slid against paper. A sound I remembered from childhood. Permission slips, report cards, notes folded too many times. I laid the first document flat. This is an attendance record, I said. My voice surprised me. Steady, lower than usual. It shows I was picked up late from school 17 times in 1 year. The contact listed alternates between 3 adults, none of whom were consistently available. My mother inhaled sharply. That doesn't... I held up a hand without looking at her. Please let me finish. The room stilled. I continued. This is an email exchange between my parents, dated May 12th when I was 11. It discusses who would be home that night. Neither of them were. The assumption was that someone else had it covered. My father shifted in his chair. Not much, just enough to register. I'm not presenting these as crimes, I said. I'm presenting them as patterns. The producer leaned forward slightly. I turned a page. These are notes from my therapist's intake session, documenting feelings of emotional displacement long before I ever discussed my parents' relationship structure in therapy. My mother shook her head slowly, tears already forming. You're making it sound like we abandoned you. I looked at her then, really looked. I'm making it sound like I learned early not to expect you, I said. Silence fell hard. The representative cleared his throat again. Mrs. He glanced at my mother's name. You stated publicly that your child's later struggles were influenced by external factors. Can you clarify what you meant? My mother hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. We believe, she began, then stopped. We believe that society's judgment and later therapy reframed things negatively. I nodded once. There it is. My father leaned forward now. You're twisting this, he said calmly. You're contextualizing normal childhood challenges through an adult lens. I met his gaze. You mean the lens that allows memory? The producer shifted uncomfortably. I slid another item across the table, a printed transcript. This is a voicemail, I said, from my father, left last month, after I asked not to be involved. My father stiffened. That's private. It was sent to me, I replied, and it pertains directly to this process. The representative nodded. You may proceed. I didn't play the audio. I didn't need to. I was told I was creating unnecessary complications, I said, that this affected more than just me. I looked around the room. What affects more than just one person is a public narrative that erases the cost paid by the child who had no voice in it. My mother's tears spilled over now. She reached for a tissue, hands trembling just enough to be visible. I don't understand why you're doing this, she whispered. Why now? I let that question hang. It deserved the weight. Because you went public, I said, and asked me to lie. The word landed like a dropped plate. The producer inhaled sharply. The legal representative scribbled something. I never asked you to lie, my mother said quickly. My father cut in. That's an interpretation. I opened the folder again and slid a printed message across the table. The exact words. The request. The framing. My mother stared at it. My father didn't touch it. The representative spoke slowly. This communication could be construed as pressure to present a predetermined narrative. The temperature in the room shifted. Subtle, immediate. My father's jaw tightened. "We are not villains," he said. "I never called you that," I replied. "I called you parents." That was when the room froze. No one spoke. Not even the hum of the overhead lights seemed real anymore. I continued, quieter now. "You raised me to be adaptable, resilient, quiet. You succeeded. What you didn't expect was that those same skills would one day allow me to stand here without shaking." My hands were flat on the table. Still. The producer cleared her throat. "Given this information," she said carefully, "we'll need to reevaluate the framing of the documentary." My mother looked up sharply. "What does that mean?" "It means," the legal representative said, "that any claim regarding child outcomes must include dissenting perspectives or be removed." My father's face drained of color. "That would undermine the entire premise," he said. I tilted my head slightly. "No," I said. "It would complicate it." The producer closed her folder. "We'll be pausing distribution until further review." My mother let out a small, broken sound. My father stared at the table, fingers flexing once, then stilling. For the first time, neither of them looked in control. The representative turned to me. "Is there anything else you'd like to add?" I thought of the cassette player, the way I'd once needed noise to survive silence. "No," I said. "I've added enough." The meeting ended shortly after. Chairs scraped, papers gathered, people avoided eye contact as they passed me. At the door, my mother reached for my arm. I stepped back. Her hand fell, empty. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, voice raw now, stripped of performance. I met her eyes one last time. "I know," I said. "You just never meant to change." I walked out into the hallway, the overhead lights harsh and unflattering, my footsteps echoing as if the building itself wanted to remember that sound. Behind me, voices rose in tense whispers. Ahead of me, the exit sign glowed steady and green. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was finally walking forward while the story I'd been forced to carry collapsed quietly in the room I'd just left. The weeks after were strangely quiet. Not the brittle silence I'd known before, the kind that punished, but a wide, open quiet that allowed sound to enter only when it mattered. I woke up without checking my phone first. I made coffee and actually tasted it. The city outside my window felt less like something I had to survive and more like something I was allowed to live in. The documentary didn't disappear overnight. Nothing ever does. But it changed shape. Friends sent me messages saying the release had been delayed, then revised, then quietly reframed. Articles softened. Language shifted. Where there had once been certainty, there were now footnotes, caution, absence. My parents stopped posting. When my father finally reached out, it wasn't with demands or framing. It was a single sentence. "We need time." I didn't reply, not because I was punishing him, but because I didn't owe immediacy anymore. Time, I'd learned, wasn't something I had to hand back just because someone asked. I returned to therapy, but the sessions felt different. Less excavation, more alignment. We talked about boundaries, not as walls, but as doors. I was finally allowed to close without explaining why. One afternoon, while reorganizing my apartment, I found the cassette player again. I held it in my hands, lighter now than it used to feel. The plastic was scratched, the label on the tape half peeled. I pressed play out of habit, not need. Music filled the room, uneven and warm. I realized something then. I didn't need it the way I once had. The sound no longer protected me from chaos. It accompanied me. That difference mattered. I packed the cassette player into a box, not hidden away, not discarded, just placed. A reminder, not a refuge. I ran into my mother once, months later, in a grocery store aisle. She looked older, smaller somehow. We stood there awkwardly between shelves of cereal, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. No cameras, no audience. She asked how I was. I said, "I'm steady." She nodded, like that word meant something she was still learning how to translate. She didn't apologize. I didn't ask her to. We parted without hugging. That too was information. What surprised me most wasn't the absence of reconciliation. It was the absence of longing for it. I'd spent so many years believing closure had to look like agreement, like remorse, like a final scene where everyone understood. But closure, it turns out, can be quiet. It can look like sleeping through the night, like choosing not to explain yourself, like letting other people carry their own discomfort without rushing in to ease it. I no longer correct the story when people ask about my family. I tell the truth briefly and stop where it stops. I don't fill in the gaps for their comfort. Some people lean in. Some pull away. That's fine. The story I live in now doesn't require universal approval. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit by the window and watch the city lights flicker on one by one. Each apartment its own universe. Each window holding a version of truth no one else fully sees. I think about how long I believed love meant adaptability, how long I believed being easy was the same as being safe. It took me decades to learn the difference. If you're holding something from your past the way I once held that cassette player, using it to survive rather than remember, know this: you're not broken for needing it, and you're not wrong for outgrowing it. If my story stayed with you, if any part of it sounded uncomfortably familiar, you don't have to smooth it out or explain it away. Sometimes, naming what happened is the first moment it stops owning you. I spent years controlling the noise just to get through the day. Now I choose when to listen and when to let the quiet speak for itself.